one day in France, her naughty little glance put Willie in a trance. Willie Earl couldn't understand.
Hello, folks. Welcome to 20th Century Adventures. I'm Nathan Logston, and today we're going to talk about period language and slang of the early 20th century. Now, I'm going to preface this by saying that while I'm not going to get into anything too grotesque, we will discuss a little bit of slang that is questionable in nature, and so some individuals may find the language somewhat offensive. May not be an episode for all ears, but I wanted to express that going forward. We're not going to get vulgar on this, I promise, but just be aware. All right. So something that I enjoy doing is at night when I'm getting ready to go to bed, it takes a while for my brain to settle down, and I like to read, but I find that if I read something that is engaging of a historic nature or really well-written quality literature, I'll sit and read it all night. And what I found was there's a lot of literature that was written mainly for young adults in the period from about 1890 up through the 1920s. And this later evolved into, and in fact, the Hardy Boys started in that late 20s era. I think the first one maybe was 1925, 1924, somewhere in there. And then that has continued on even today. They're still published, new versions. And later, the Nancy Drew mysteries, it's that level, young adult novels. But it's fluff. Most of them are predictable. They've got roughly the same plot line, and it's almost mindless reading, but it's entertaining, and it helps my brain shut down so that I can go to sleep. And I've really enjoyed a lot of them. But one thing that I have picked up, and all of these were written in the period as a modern book. And you'll see advertisements sometimes in the backs of these books for other book series. Often there's a character or several characters that'll run through anywhere from 5 to 30 books. Tom Swift is a great example where he just continued on for decades. Even Tom Swift Jr., which was his son in the storyline, those novels came out in the 40s and 50s and were very science fiction oriented, which Tom Swift was science fiction for his time. It was almost Jules Vernish. But anyway, so I enjoy reading these, and the thing that I've picked up in reading them is the language. The language is distinctly different from what we speak today. And this being, some of those advertisements mentioned these books were written with the latest slang and technology. And so they're cutting edge of the period. So the language that's in them is what young people were using in that time period. Now, if you really want to enhance your historical impression, you can begin to incorporate some of this period language and period slang, and it'll really improve the overall impression, because not only do you look right, but now you sound right too. And to do that, most people carry the language of their youth. And some things fall out of fashion real fast. My parents' generation, a handful of them still use the word groovy, but for the most part, it has fallen out of our national language. But it was very popular when they were young. So we don't necessarily want to use 1928 slang, because if you're doing an earlier impression, well, that just hasn't arrived yet. And the only people that are going to be using that slang are going to be the people that are young, teenagers in that period. So as a youth, doing an impression, say 1925 to 1929, yeah, you'll use the latest slang of that period. But me being 40 in 1928, I'm not going to use that slang. I'm going to use the slang of my youth, 20, 25 years before. And that holds true today. I hardly ever see things advertised for young people anymore with the word extreme in it. But when I was 16, boy, everything was extreme. There were extreme sports. There was extreme Mountain Dew. There was just, literally everything. So that's the way it would be in these periods as well. And again, we go back to World War One, and you see all this change culturally and in technology and everything else going on. The whole world changed, and you even see that in these books. Some of these books, they'll have a series where it's the same characters and they go on for a while, and the books are very innocent. No one ever gets seriously hurt, and certainly not killed. But you get into the period of the war and immediately after, and the characters go to war. They go to France and they fight, and they become very dark, very fast. Stories that even the worst criminal gets safely captured, no one gets hurt, and he goes to jail. And that's the plot of the book. And every book is that innocent. And then you get into 1917, 1918 publications, and boy, these kids are seeing characters dying left and right, and lots of blood and gore, and a dark, heavy overtone to the stories. So World War One changed America and the whole world dramatically, and we'll see that as we talk more about language here. So these are just some examples of some of the books. I've got dozens of these that I've picked up. You can find them in antique stores for less than $5 usually, because they're so prolific, and people have given them to me because they know I like them. And then what really ended up being a kicker was I found out that most of these books are either free or 99 cents on Kindle, and sometimes you can buy the whole set on Kindle of, say, 25 books for like $5. So you can read these till the cows come home. I don't think that if I had my whole lifetime to read and every book from that period still existed, that I could read them all in a lifetime. There's just so many of them. They're very prolific. So that's where I've picked up a lot of period slang, and it's interesting. And so the books that are published from let's assume that I'm 40 and it's 1925, so I would have been a youth in 1905, or maybe a little earlier even. So I would want those earlier books and pull the language from those earlier books, which is a little harder because there's not as many of them. So you kind of have to tailor it how you want to. And really, any period language and slang that you can throw in there is going to be great, even if it's a little later than your period that you would have used it. And some people do pick up on modern language. I would never today say something is on fleek, but my teenage son occasionally uses words like that, and it's foreign to me because I'm not used to that language. So I wouldn't necessarily pick that up. But in texting and internet lingo, I do use the abbreviation LOL for laugh out loud, which is slang, and it's something that I, as an adult, have picked up, even though it's something after the time that I was forming my speech patterns. So you can mix it up, you can play with it. Really, you want to use World War One as the dividing line, though, in kind of, because there's a lot of language that comes in because of World War One, and so you'll see that as we progress here. But anyway, I've written down just a handful of some of my favorites, and I'm going to talk about those a little bit here. Now, this is where it's going to get a little bit blue for just a second is I want to talk about foul language. And, foul language is very pervasive in our society today. And I really, personally, I don't like to use a lot of that sort of language. I don't like to hear it around me because I feel like there's so many words in the English language, and you can express yourself so much better than just using the same four-letter word over and over, even if you can use it for a noun, adjective, or verb. So I try to encourage my friends to, use something more creative. However, those words existed. I can find all kinds of references going back to the 18th century for common words that we use every day. Well, we as in the culture use every day. I don't. But words like, the F word or things like that, four-letter words that are very common. Those did exist, and they show up from time to time in various places throughout the 19th century. But they weren't published generally. It's very rare that you find a publication that will have a word that strong in it. By the 19th century, by the mid 19th century especially, words like bloody and bugger were becoming very common and didn't necessarily warrant censorship. A lot of publications would put the first letter and the last letter and blank out the center. But it was considered common enough language that it wouldn't scandalize a woman to read the publication. And that's really what they based all their censorship on was men use this, but is it okay for a woman to hear this? And so through the 19th century, that culture remained. Now, by the time we get to World War I, we have the largest collection of soldiers from around the world coming together in what is arguably the most violent situation up to that time that the world had ever seen. And soldiers traditionally, the term that we use today is curse like a sailor. And there's a reason for that, because soldiers and sailors and people that are in that situation, they want to show bravado. They want to show how tough they are, how rugged they are. And when you're 18 years old and you're scared out of your mind, the only way that you can think of to show how tough you are is through your language. So in World War I, we suddenly see things that are being recorded in diaries, not usually letters home, because we didn't want mom to know what we say in the trenches. And so letters home were usually very cordial and polite, but letters to friends back home sometimes would be more spicy. And publications that were done just for the trenches, especially in the range of music, songs, bawdy songs have always been a favorite among soldiers, and were then too. But more men in the world were exposed to that sort of daily harsh language than had ever been done before. And they brought it home, and it became a part of the national vernacular. And after the hardships that women had seen in working with the Red Cross and working as nurses overseas, they saw soldiers coming in mortally wounded. And when you're 18 and you're dying, and you know you're dying, you care less about what people think of you. And so certainly they were hearing some strong language, and they were hearing, they were experiencing death and blood and guts and gore on a level that women had been protected from for a large portion of history, unless they were in a battlefield situation like that. But more women, young women, were exposed to that than had ever been exposed before. So women become less scandalized by that sort of language. And we see that really, especially in the Roaring Twenties, with a lot of songs that are actually now being published and poems that are being published that have language in them that just 30 years before would have been too scandalous to put into print. And that's continued on to the point where we are today, where you can't scroll through Facebook without seeing strong four-letter words. So that's where cursing and that sort of language comes in. But we're going to roll it back. We're going to talk about things that you can use in mixed company, that you can use around children, and have some fun with. But I wanted to address that portion because I know somebody's going to ask about it, and I just wanted to get it out there. All right. So here's a few things that I wrote down that just stood out to me as something that'd be fun to use in a camp situation or something. So very common, one of the most common things that I have seen over and over and over, especially early. This goes from the beginning of the 1890s on up through the 1930s, still being used, and today has fallen almost entirely out of use, is to call your friend old man or old boy. And we think of that today as being a British thing, old chap, but it was actually very American. And chap is certainly British. But to call your best friend old man was super common, and everybody did it, and did it for a long time. So as we all in my personal group get older, I'm going to have a lot of fun calling my friends old man. Another thing that has shows up in almost every book that I've ever read, as far as these youth novels, is "that's going some," and what that means is that's really great, that's awesome. The same way that we would use that, they would say that's really going some. I really don't know where that comes from. Possibly it shows up around the period that we have the internal combustion engine, we have automobiles, we have trains that are steam powered, we've got automobiles that are steam or gasoline powered, and so something that is new and the latest technology, you could say that it goes fast, and maybe that's where it comes from. I'm not really sure, but that's going some. That's a great one. Now this one I can really place pretty easily, because again we're talking about the period of steam locomotives, steam tractors. Lots of things run on steam at this period, and so if somebody got really angry, you would say he got steamed up. And if you have a steam boiler, steam engine, if that boiler reaches a certain pressure level, it will burst. And so that buildup of pressure prior to a burst is similar to somebody just really getting angry and they're getting steamed up. And sometimes that still gets used today. I've heard people say, I'm really steamed about this, but I don't think they know why they use that, but that's why, and that's where it comes from. Now, here's one that always gets a good laugh, because we use our 21st century minds when we hear this. But the word boner, don't laugh. The word boner was really commonly used to represent a boneheaded mistake. If somebody was really just an idiot and did something that was obviously stupid, you would say, he did a boner. Don't laugh. That leads me to this next one, which is lay off. Lay off the laughing. So lay off, the best historical reference I can find to that is it's a term used in sailing. When you're leaving the dock, you order to lay off, or if you're coming into a dock with a rowboat and you want to put the oars up, you say ship oars or lay off. And so that goes back to the 18th century. It could be that it's something that was just brought over from that because layoff could mean to stop or to start. But in this case, I'm pretty sure it means to stop, lay off. And today, even still, we say lay off me. So that's the one that's not too foreign to us. One that, again, is not foreign to us and we probably are very used to is the word earful. To give somebody an earful is to chew them out. And that's not one that we still use today. Stir crazy came in this period as well, which I think we're all pretty familiar with. Now, here's one that gets really interesting, and I see this without fail every time. And I think the end of it is probably somewhere in around 1930, and it comes in about 1900. But when somebody says, let's not, or don't do this, but if it's communally with me included, I would say don't let's. So, for example, in modern terminology, and this leads to another one, fight is rarely used. Row seems to be more common, and it's still used in the UK today, in British vernacular, but we don't use it in America anymore. But at this time, it was more common to say row than to say fight. And so if you were going to say, let's not fight about this, you would say, don't let's have a row about this. And that's your early 20th century vernacular. And without fail, if some guys are on a fishing camp and one fellow feels sick, he'll get up and he'll say, don't let's go fishing today. I don't know where that comes from or why it's arranged that way. I haven't been able to find a definite answer, but it certainly is, and it certainly was very common. So speaking of things that are borderline acceptable in mixed company, and another one you can choke up your friends with is nowadays, if someone says they made love, we apply that to sexual intercourse. That's a modern interpretation. In, say, 1910, making love meant that you were whispering sweet nothings, you were bringing flowers, you were courting. Making love is synonymous with courting in at least up to 1930. I'm not sure beyond that where it changes, but it certainly did not mean sexual intercourse in that pre-1930 period. Similarly, you would say someone was on the make if they were flirting. If they weren't courting necessarily, but they were, waving and smiling and saying things that were of a somewhat romantic nature, what we would call flirting today, that was on the make. Again, like making love. So if you were really strongly against something, if you were, say, a teetotaler of alcohol and a prohibitionist, then people who were pro-alcohol would call you an againster. Anybody who was against anything. If they were, say, a conscientious objector from the war, they would say that's a war againster. Awkward to say in modern vernacular, but is what it is. So another one that I use this a lot actually, because of my antique cars. The word Fliver. And that is how it's pronounced. I know there's some question as to whether it's Fliver or Fliver, but if you listen to songs that have the word in it and what those, how those are pronounced in those songs, and also with the words that they rhyme with, it's pretty obvious that it's Fliver. So a Fliver is any broken down vehicle. It can be a car or a plane, but it's a machine of transportation that is cheap and broken down and can't be trusted. That's a Fliver. And generally, that term was applied to Model T Fords. Fords took a beating all the time because they were cheap cars and they were very minuscule in their comforts, and they didn't have a lot of suspension, but they could go anywhere. They were really tough, rugged little cars, um, but they, got this reputation for Tin Lizzie or a Tin Can, as sometimes they were called, and they were commonly called Flivers. But it actually can apply to any machine with an engine. A lunker is someone or something, usually an animal, that exceeds size expectations. So if you get a German Shepherd puppy and you think, oh, this dog's going to get to be so many pounds, and he gets a lot bigger than that, you would call that dog a lunker. And I don't know where that one comes from either. So here's a fun one that can be used in place of foul language. If you are one that's prone to use four-letter words as an adjective, that's cracking. Can be a standalone phrase to mean that something is great, really good, or it can be used as an adjective for something else. So you might say, that's cracking great, and you can imply what word that could be used for. So that's one to work into your vernacular if you're one that generally uses strong language and wishes not to around a family camp. One of my personal favorites, because I'm a huge fan of Teddy Roosevelt, and he was the one that made this bit of slang popular, is the word bully. And we don't mean bully as in the guy on the playground that beats you up for your lunch money. Really, it comes from, most likely comes from Teddy Roosevelt himself. He was an avid outdoorsman. When he created his own political party in 1912, he called it the Bull Moose Party, and he would raise his fist and go, bully! And he was really famous for that. And people picked it up almost immediately. Of course, Teddy Roosevelt was wildly popular in and of himself. I haven't found bully to exist prior to Teddy Roosevelt's first presidency. And so I really think that it originated with him. I could be wrong. Feel free to correct me on that. But certainly young people picked it up immediately, and it carried on well into the 1920s that you would say, that's bully, or bully for us, or just simply as a cheer, bully. That's a screamer if something's really funny. And today we would say that's a scream. But in the early 20th century, you would say that's a screamer if something was really funny. Now we'll talk a little bit about a couple of things that come out of World War I specifically. This one's interesting. There was a phrase that was used really only during World War I and for a few years after, and it completely died away. It didn't stick around. But the word was Napu. And most likely Napu is an American deterioration of the French phrase il n'y a plus. And it literally, my French is terrible, I apologize. It literally means there is no more. And so Napu was used in place of kaput, which was a German word, and we didn't want to use German words. And kaput predates World War I. To say that something is kaput, it's out of commission. But because that's a German word, Americans and French didn't want to use it, and so they adopted this Napu, and it was one of those situations where they were just changing the word as a way of being patriotic. And it didn't really catch on, and the word kaput came back into our vernacular and to some extent is still used today. The last one that I want to touch on is a very difficult word to pin down, but you'll see it in any literature from the World War I era and even some from the World War II era. The word was used in World War II as well. But the word is Bosch, and it is considered a derogatory term towards Germans. So any Germans that are watching this, I apologize, but it was a very heavily used word in that period. And there's really, it's hard to say where it comes from. So the earliest reference that I can find is the word Bosch, which is actually an English word. It's Bosh, and it's a Victorian term that means utter nonsense. And people who spoke utter nonsense were called Boschers, and or Boschers. So that's one who speaks nonsense. That came into heavy use in the 20th century before World War One. So possibly soldiers hearing German language and the foreign sound of it might have said, "It sounds like utter nonsense. They must be Boschers." But there's also some suggestion that it comes from the French word kibosh. And I've seen all kinds of references to what the word kibosh means. Technically, if you just put the word into Google Translate, it comes back as a noggin, which is a combination bowl cup thing. And that doesn't make any sense at all. But there is an archaic version of the word kibosh in French, which means an imbecile or an idiot, used the same way as blockhead. And the word Doomkopf, the German word Doomkopf, which means dumb head, comes from or comes into the American vernacular before World War One. So we had a lot of German immigrants coming in. Some German words worked their way in. Doomkopf was a word that people knew. And so it's, again, possible that the soldiers got over there and they said, look, we don't want to use Doomkopf because it's a German word. We're anti-German right now. So what's the French word for that? And they said kibosh. And so, of course, Americans being Americans, they shortened it and abbreviated it and came up with Bosch. But it was generally a derogatory term that meant Germans. They also called them Huns, which again is something not very approved today. And I really don't know where that comes from, to be honest. But those are some phrases that you can use, that you can learn. And we'll add these words into the comment or into the description on the video so that you can see how they're spelled and everything too. So I hope you had some fun with this. I hope you enjoy putting some period vernacular into your speech when you're doing living history. And if you like this video, please like it and subscribe to it, because that's how we're going to continue doing more videos. Thank you so much. Have a great time. We'll see you down the road.
They would spoon beneath the moon above. It was fun to hear them making love. She'd say, comprenez-vous, papa? And he'd say, ooh la la, oui, oui. She'd smile and whisper, merci beaucoup. He'd answer, I don't mind if I do. She'd say, if you be my papa, then I will be your mom.